From dewy dreams my soul arise, from love's deep slumber and from death. For lo, the trees are full of sighs, whose leaves the morn admonisheth. Admonisheth? Once again, we've got one of these strange coinages which are scattered all the way through this particular sequence. Admonisheth, to tell somebody off. For lo, the trees are full of sighs, whose leaves the morn admonisheth. What's he doing? Who is it that needs to be told off here? And what is it that's going on here in the woods? This had occurred slightly earlier in the sequence, in the Stanislaus Joyce ordering, because it is a strange thing, because it's a fantasy poem. It's a fantasy poem which thinks about some kind of transgression, but also a transgression that hasn't actually happened with the girl. It's a fantasy poem. It's an erotic dream. It's an erotic dream which is full of dewiness, and it's also filled with certain things that are happening just before the dawn. This, of course, is the dream appears in various things, making to tremble all those veils of grey and golden gossamer. And I think that what we have to imagine to ourselves here is some kind of Renaissance beauty who has finally come into the dream of the lover. Sweetly, gently, secretly, the flowery bells of morn are stirred. The wise choirs of fairy begin numerous to be heard. The fairy, of course, could be there because of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, or one of those kinds of dream poems. Fairy can also be there because this, we've got to remember, Now and Again is an Irish poem, and the fairies are quite frequently hanging around in Irish poems of the 1890s, most famously indeed in Yeats's Wind Among the Reeds. And that Wind Among the Reeds, again, these are dawn poems, poems of the morning, poems of dream shading into daylight. And this is another one of those poems of dream shading into daylight. Joyce works through this particular theme again in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, just before he gives us the only poem that Stephen Dedalus is seen to write in the entirety of our knowledge of Stephen Dedalus, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and again in Ulysses. We only actually see this poet or this artist produce one piece of art, and that is a poem that he's written as he's waking up again out of a dewy dream. And this again is one of those dewy dream poems. It's saturated with fantasy, saturated with all kinds of previous poetry, all kinds of other things that are going on here. And indeed, it's also saturated with a kind of eroticism that's going through here. The wise choirs of fairy begin innumerous to be heard. Once again, the polysyllabic word sitting there in this particular instance with an exclamation mark, which is a most un-Joycean thing. But of course, what is happening here is the overpowering of the lover in fantasy. And again, a very strange and a most unusual theme to introduce into the sequence at this stage, where technically speaking, he's got the girl.